Right now in Sudan, anarchist comrades are organizing in the middle of a war, repression, and displacement. The anarchist group in Sudan is building mutual aid, grassroots committees, and political education for survival and liberation. They need our support. You can stand with them by making a one-time donation, holding your own fundraiser and sending the funds to the Open Collective, Support Sudanese Comrades, link in bio, or become a monthly supporter at that same Open Collective link. Every contribution strengthens their ability to keep resisting and caring for their people. Solidarity means action. Tap the link in our bio or in the show notes and support the anarchist group in Sudan today.
Hey everyone, we're excited to invite you to join us on Patreon. By supporting us, you'll be helping us keep the podcast going and make it possible for us to continue sharing Black radical ideas and history. On Patreon, you'll get exclusive access to reading episodes, where we break down important texts as well as early access to our guest interview. Your support also helps us create more educational resources, like a website that will include educational modules about our episode topics and potential live streams. If you want to learn more and support the podcast, visit patreon.com/the Dugout Pod. Every contribution makes a difference.
My name is Prince. I am an organizer, media maker, artist out of Central Ohio, and I co-host the Dugout Black Anarchist podcast. I published a memoir a few years ago, and I like asking a lot of questions in media about Black history, Black radicalism, intersectionality, kind of big existential questions around the emotional side of organizing. And I love Malcolm X. I think he's kind of camp in a certain way when you listen to his speeches. So I'm excited to talk. Really excited to talk about him today.
Mhm.
Oh, wow. That was lovely. I'm Jordan. I'm the other co-host of the Dugout, a Black Anarchist podcast. I'm a chef, I'm a baker, and I like to read and write and be with my friends and family and think about how we can build different structures and infrastructure to take care of our needs and what we got to do to defend it. Yeah, that's me. I'm so happy to be here. Long-time listener, first-time caller.
Right. Hey, too. I'm excited to be here. I'm Israa. I'm part of the From the Periphery Media Collective, and I'm here as host of the Fire These Times. And yeah, I also do like the Mutual Aid podcast and check our work out. It's pretty interesting stuff. And same, I'm excited to be here with y'all. Like, it's long time listener, love your work, and so excited to get a chance to like work with you closer. Malcolm X was both like a step into the politicization for me and my political awakening, and gave me language that I really struggled to find anywhere else and answer questions that I was not finding anywhere else. And also like was a point that as I continued through my journey, was something like, he always came back to because of his own process of evolution. And so, yeah, I'm really excited to kind of dig with y'all his influence on us and his thought process and where we're at. So yours, Mohammed.
Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Peace be upon you all. اللهم اشرح لي صدري ويسر لي أمري واحلل عقدة من لساني يفقهوا قولي. May Allah, inshallah, undo the knots in our tongues and open up the breasts and such that we may share, inshallah, and allow the spirit of our shining Black Prince to course through us. Given the nature of our discussion, I'm Mohamed Abdou. I'm a student of the Muqawma, a student of our indigenous Black and people of color ancestors. Yes, I'm a self-identifying Muslim anarchist, but what does that mean if Islam is inherently anarchistic? The author of Islam and Anarchism. I started a Substack a few months ago, maybe 5 months ago, called End Times, where I explore anti and decolonial readings of the resistance, particularly in Palestine and beyond, in relationship to the Black Panthers, Black Liberation Army, Black anarchists, as well as decolonial indigenous trajectories. been a social movement organizer post Seattle 1999. Spent time with the Zapatistas, Lift Tahrir. Land defense work with the Mohawks in Tantanega in the mid 2000s. And I'm currently based in Cairo. I'm a recovering academic, I guess, at this point. And yeah, it's such an honor to be with you all and to be doing this for sure. I'm very grateful for you.
I guess one of the questions that I had that I'm really interested in that I think might be a good way to start us off is what Malcolm X what Malcolm X did you meet? When did you meet him, get to know him? And why did he matter then? Why has he continued to matter to you now? I'm just very curious because I think how we arrive to people, what they mean to us, and how that changes over time, I think is really an underlying part of why I love history and radical history. But yeah, I'm curious for all of you.
I can start us off. So I met Malcolm when I was in high school. I remember taking out the book from the public library, like I stumbled upon it. And it was during a period where I was taking, I think, governments and politics as like the history course. And so like getting curious about government work and how these structures and systems work and looking for more answers and just a deeper understanding. And I remember sitting literally in my mosque and reading it. At the time, the two things that like really caught my attention with Malcolm, he spoke of the Black experience in America in a way that for me answered questions that the history books were not. And he spoke about gender as in a way that also addressed some of the shit that I was experiencing in my own life. And he didn't cop out with like, well, this is what God said, and this is how it is. And like he really he tried to explain why the situation was what it is. And I was right at the time, like getting curious about this stuff, asking questions, and essentially being told, whether it's from parents or elders or teachers, like this is just how it is. Like read the history book. What's in the history book is the facts, and that's that. Of course, Malcolm wasn't in the history books. Like Martin was introduced for obvious reasons, and Rosa Parks, but it was like this very minute understanding of the civil rights movement, of Black history in the States. And the fact that he was Muslim and Black for me was like very eye-opening. I hadn't met any Black Muslims up at that point. And very quickly after that, being like on the outskirts of New York City, like my world expanded significantly. Once I like kind of stepped out of the curated world my parents had created. And so Malcolm was the reasoning I started to ask more about history and wanting to read from people other than like what the textbooks were claiming. And through that, basically, he became this like constant like, I don't want to like, his influence I could feel in my political evolution. And I think for nothing else, like I think a lot about like how he evolved from himself. Like I was rereading the autobiography for our prep work and seeing how he was unashamed of himself, unashamed of like his past, unashamed of who he was and how he stood and how he took up space in the world, and also unashamed of like to share his turbulent past and like this is where I was and what I did wasn't because I'm bad or this and that. This is the situation that was in. This is the context. This is the circumstances, and that itself was very world shaking because I grew up in a world where like shame was such a huge influence in like how you existed, and you can't talk about your mistakes. You can't share, like even if you learn from them, you keep them hidden, right? Doesn't matter what it is. And so to see someone who was like so unapologetic, willing to not only admit their journey and share about it, but their lessons, and to constantly be like talking about like, well, I used to think this, now I think this, and here's my analysis of why I used to do this and this and that. And so like it was really eye-opening to kind of experience someone who is willing to look at themselves as part of the whole thing and really dig into themselves and evolve in the process and like see where that landed up. So it really felt like he was seeking the truth. And in that process, his liberation, his thoughts, and his politics evolved from there.
Yeah, that that makes me think. I think the first time I saw um Malcolm X's Malcolm X's autobiography, and I think I was 12, and it was the graphic novel version, and I was uh like I think 8 months into an 11-month stay at a inpatient mental health hospital, and I was reading it. I think I was reading a shit ton of stuff. That time I was like really in my academic bag. I had all my friends give me like textbooks and different things so I could like do math problems and study and have heavy things to throw at people. And um, I remember reading it and thinking about how much it satisfied who I was and who I wanted to be, because there was a point in which in there, like, I was always filing grievances. I was always had a stack of them printed out with the staff's name already written on it. And I just would go up to people and be like, he did something, time this, figure it out. At least we have a record. Let's get it done. Um, and then like also satisfying that same edge to like be ready to defend yourself. And you see someone else getting messed up. How angry are you? Are you close? Is it across from your room? Can you throw a bottle? Can I? Will I? Can I? Will I? And I remember reading that, like, really helping emboldening me near the end of my stay, to the point where like I got like my case officer fired. And as soon as I got moved to a new case officer, I was out within like 2 weeks. Big cash for bed situation. The whole space got closed down, like sued to shit like 2 times, even when they tried to reopen. Um, but I think it was very much something that very unconsciously steadied my struggle as like a period of time that I've been reflecting on more. Um, and in that same line, I really have appreciated this conversation to help envision like what other people's stories and access points are and what and how it was resonating. Even to like him around his racial identity and all his stuff with his hair and all that, like what he was examining, what was implicit, what was social, what was not. And those were conversations that I would keep in my head, but never really address until I hit like a critical mass point near like high school and stuff, but really hitting that reflection in like 2020. Because as soon as I get out of high school, I'm like, what's going on downtown? And then boom, flashbang. I'm like, yo, where are the people at? And here we are today. You're a reflection.
And I guess I'll add that I first learned about Malcolm X, I think in like middle school. It was a very simplistic explanation, Malcolm X versus MLK. And when I graduated college, I basically did a lot of reading and research about like Black radical history. And I was listening to a lot of speeches when I was a housekeeper. And I think Malcolm X was one of the first kind of people I started listening to a lot of his speeches. And I was also reading about the Black Panther Party and just kind of trying to build my own arsenal of understanding. And I read his autobiography. And I mean, it's kind of like why when people ask like, oh, what books do you recommend? It's usually like autobiographies or political memoirs, because if you can be invested in someone's like lived experience, history, whether or not they're a person of significance, I think it can be really just moving. And I remember reading his autobiography and kind of similar to what Jordan was saying, like there's a certain explicit rage that I think he unleashes and utilizes and is clear about. And I love listening to his speeches as well and hearing how logical his assessments of things are, even if like he uses hyperbole or extremes sometimes. And also just the sense of love, because I do think a lot of organizing or facing state violence or political violence, it's the oscillating between love and rage. And even in reading his book, like there's parts of it where I'm like, oh, I wouldn't have said it that way, or oh, you're saying that you need to marry a woman half your age plus 5 according to your religion. And so there were also things I read in it that I didn't love, but the love that surrounded those mistakes or the qualms that I had it's so felt. And I think it's felt in how he would criticize Martin Luther King, and especially when you feel how his spirit is navigating things in the latter half of the book. There's a lot of humanity that I think he's kind of trying to explore. And yeah, and I think definitely one of the first Black men that I read on that level, where I don't know, I felt a kinship to how angry he was and how he also allowed himself to change.
I guess like all of you. I mean, I met Malcolm when I was about 14, 15 years old, and there are 3 books I remember in my parents' bookshelves that particularly stood out at the center of the bookshelves, next to the image of Jamal Abdel Nasser, the Pan-Arab socialists. There's Alex Haley's Roots. There was Malcolm's autobiography that you all referred to. And there was Frantz Fanon's Black Skin, White Masks. And I was particularly juggling, I recall quite vividly, between Fanon and Malcolm's autobiography. And to me, as you all had noted, Malcolm was rage. Malcolm was revolutionary love. Malcolm was very transparent, clear-eyed, unveiled. He lived his history before the public and in the eyes of the world. He was very transparent. I can't find an alternative. There was no private for him. It was all public. He walked, as he noted, as a dead man that died 40 years ago. That's how he lived his life. What struck me about him is that his insatiable hunger for knowledge, his alma mater were books, as he noted, his endless metamorphoses. He wasn't an ideologist. He wasn't beholden to any particular idea or set of ideas. His emphasis on growth, evolution, transformation, like a butterfly that's constantly breaking out of whatever sets of the confines of a cocoon that's seeking to confine him. You couldn't pin him down. He was Black. He was a Pan-Africanist. He was an internationalist. He was a Muslim. And hence the fraughtness, I guess, over his legacy. It was fearless. He possessed the soft, effeminate component of his personality, his love for his family, for his wife, Betty. His friendship with a queer Black man by the name of James Baldwin, right? And the intimacy that involved. Shirley Graham, Du Bois's second wife, who took him underneath, her wings in Ghana and introduced him to Nkrumah. And for me, the magic of Malcolm was, for me personally, as Israa had noted, when she's talking about, reading Malcolm in the masjid, is growing up in mosques where Muslims are constantly engaged in dua or supplications at the end of every Friday prayers of, Ya Allah, Palestine, oh Ya Allah, Afghanistan, oh Ya Allah, Kashmir, oh Ya, the oppressed of the world, the meek of the world. And he symbolized as a certain walking, talking Quran of the oppressed, like a gift, a verse from God, a prophet, a messenger, if you will, a bearer of the torch, a renewer of the discourse of Islam. And to me, that's what was most striking, as I'm caught between Pan-Arabism, Pan-Africanism, a racial discourse, but also a spiritual discourse that's supposed to transcend the elements of race. And once witnessing, of course, fraud anti-Blackness that exists within Southwest Asian, North African communities, and trying to contend with that. So what is it? Is it the secular racial discourse Is it the religious discourse, the fusion between both? Yeah, and having it contend with like 1492 ramifications, right? So 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 yeah, that's the Malcolm uh, uh, that I met, that I continue to meet every single time I hear his voice, or yeah, read what he's written, um, in relation, yeah, in relationship to the various different moments, the breakthroughs that happen in his life, which I'm sure we're gonna get to. His visit to Palestine, his break away from the nation, um, and it's beautiful to witness. Yeah, I think he was more beholden to spiritual and ethical political commitments more than he was any particular, again, idea or solidified or trajectory. Yeah.
Prince, we're talking about the speech, the bullet or the ballot, and he starts off claiming like, I'm not here to talk to you about Islam. I'm not here as a Muslim. I'm not here to engage in about religion talk. I am here to talk about liberation, about Black nationalism, right? To me, he's like, that's a personal matter between you and God. And so like,
And also in that, he says, some of y'all need to leave your religion in the closet.
Right.
It ain't doing that.
yeah, right. Which is like such a huge thing because like it shows that he's not getting his power from the religion itself. Although he keeps talking about Islam as this possible revolutionary force that'll overtake the West, that there's gonna be more converts, but Islam itself isn't the thing. Like the religion itself, it became like a vessel towards liberation itself, right? It's like his commitment was Black nationalism, was freedom of Black people in the U.S., was freedom of all oppressed people, and Islam reflected a lot of the morals and ethics that he wanted to engage in, and so he was using that as a vessel for his personal evolution and journey, but he wasn't imposing it on others, which is for me like keeps him with the people, because even as he gained like prominence and his power socially, like culturally, socially, like he gained capital, it wasn't a like, and yeah, you could listen to his speech and there's a lot of like do this and do that, but he's still, to me, it's not imposing. It's like the sermon he's giving, he's trying to inspire change, inspire motivation, but it's not like, I don't see acts of like him engaging in exploitative ways, right? Like he's not creating a mosque where he's reaping the benefits of the mosque. He's not creating a center where he's reaping the benefits from that, which is not the same in other religious spaces, being Islamic or others that I've seen, right? And I think that for me, like really showed that above else, he was committed to the principles of a liberated, just, equitable world. And his journey took him from one place, like followings of Elijah Muhammad, but then evolving from there to the point where he's able to break away from that, which in itself, I think speaks volumes, because I think a lot about our identities and how identities forms how we see ourselves and think about ourselves. And even when they go against, like, we say one thing and we do another thing, but we've attached ourselves to a certain identity. If we start questioning too much, it becomes like there's defense mechanisms that get triggered. All these things that happen internally that force you to lock in more into identity rather than question and evolve and grow and release. And I think Malcolm is an example of that, of like being able to like look at like, okay, what's the situation? This is what I've attached to. This is where my identity is. I mean, he venerates Elijah even after the breakup, right? Like he talks about him as this like great spiritual leader, even as data, more and more data showed that like, no, actually you really need to rethink this person as like on a pedestal type of situation. He didn't talk shit about him, but instead he himself evolved. Malcolm himself was like, okay, I'm gonna take what I need to take, and now I'm gonna go a different path and evolve from there. And that's something that, as like people who claim that we want to be in resistance against systems of oppression, that we want to engage in revolutionary action and a revolutionary life, like we need to be able to release those things that anchor us to these certain ideas and evolve with as new data and new information emerges for us, you know?
Yeah. And what I think, what I hear you talk about that is, I guess I think about ego versus revolutionary responsibility,
Mm.
because in a lot of ways, when I see how Malcolm worked through contradictions and what was happening in the nation of Islam with Elijah Muhammad and his abuses of other people, um, you can see that he's working through revolutionary responsibility. Like, I've been advocating that people join this political spiritual project. I've been bringing different kinds of folks in, including women. And this is what is happening to them because of the contradictions at play. And then I also think about how he talked about peaceful nonviolent resistance, and how for him there was he kind of argues against MLK, because he's like, your political responsibility to Black people is to help them be strong, help them to survive, not just allow them to be beaten up by the white man or the oppressor. And so whether or not you agree with his assessment of peaceful nonviolence explicitly, there is the kind of underlying question of, why do the oppressed have to experience suffering in order to be seen as more human?
Mm-hmm.
And so, and then he kind of posits that in sort of this place of ego in a way, and in how he kind of critiques it, which I find to be interesting. But I think of like revolutionary responsibility, where it's like, what were the leaders of the Black Panther Party doing? What mistakes did they oust? What women and others were allowed to be abused or mistreated in their ranks? And it's kind of why, in some ways, I mean, I don't know. I don't want to. There's like a hierarchy of revolutionary consciousness, but I do feel and understand Malcolm to be someone that wants to be responsible in terms of like this revolutionary praxis and approach. And that doesn't mean that everything that he did was perfect, but I do think it means it's evident what he's working through and how he's not just jumping to conclusions because it seems like the right thing to do. There's like a process.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that piece is like really important. What you're saying is like, he's not a perfect person. Rereading a lot of his stuff, there's like, I definitely noticed things that was like getting triggered in me. That was like, I don't know about this. Like, so I'm noticing the parts of me that like doesn't agree with him in this moment. And I kept on going back to like, well, do I cancel him? Do I stop admitting like his influence on me? Like, what do I, but the reality is like, he was willing to admit when he was wrong and he continued evolving. And I think that's literally all that we could ask of any of us. Like, is like, just try and keep your minds open and keep evolving as information comes in. Yeah.
He was humble. And I think that's one of the most important characteristics for any revolutionary to abide by. And it goes hand in hand, because it's not a false humility when you're capable of transformation or engaging in the greater jihad of the self at the same time. I do struggle with the element of, spirituality in the closet, because I read it more as a paradox than I do a contradiction, because he's using Islam as a vehicle without necessarily naming Islam. But the spiritual dimension, even some elements of the lexicon are on the tip of his tongue, especially post Mecca, because by then, well, that's when the ballad and the bullet speech happens. Is post Mecca, post Bandung. There's more of an international discourse that's evolving. He's no longer concerned with civil rights. He's more concerned with quote unquote human rights, because he sees as that more of the universalist paradigms that is able to transcend the logic of governments being in control of civic rights. Right. The Afro-Asiatic sort of conference had happened, as we noted, Bandung. He takes on a much more internationalist trajectory, and of course, sitting down and breaking bread, as he notes, with a white man in Mecca. It's just like, there's the blonde-haired, blue-eyed devil that I refer to as the devil, and him and I are eating from the same shared plate. So then what is Islam? So yeah, there are the elements, when I think it's very interesting that Jackie Alexander makes the argument that we all need to step out of the spiritual closet, and Malcolm in certain moments wants to domesticate, in a certain sense, Islam. But this is where I wonder his further evolution, because from a theological perspective, one of the major influences is also like an Egyptian scholar, Dr. Mohamed Shawarbi, right? And in Malcolm, he sees a great leader of Islam in the context of Turtle Island or settler colonial context of the U.S., right? But yeah, what happens is Malcolm gets assassinated, right? But yeah, being under the tutelage of also Shawarbi, it would be, I guess this is part of what we're exploring too. What would Malcolm say now? Or what would he be thinking now in the context, as you notice, of the Arab monarchic regimes, Saudi Arabia, a lot of different dimensions, indigenous struggles. He was an organizer, not a mobilizer, unlike MLK. This is something that even Kwame Ture had pointed to, organizing around structures, not around issues, which mobilization entails. So incredible orator like MLK. But yeah, he was constantly speaking to the below, and his language was a language of the below. His speeches were always ceremony, which is a feature that I think is necessary as part of his life trajectory. What happened with him, his parents, were Darwinists. But also, I think he really embodied the certain heart and spirit of Islam within itself that allowed him an access to speak with the people and to walk amongst them, not to really speak to to center the above in his speeches, but rather to speak with, not speak to.
I think in thinking, when I think of what would he be doing now, um, I think about like what beauty he saw in the container for Islam to have that power of unity. And like what he was doing near the end of his life with the Organization of Afro-American Unity. And I was going back to its founding documents and like just like creating these like federated structures, and just having and realizing like the need for like another type of space or container for like self-organized institutions, like voluntary groups, caucuses, whatever, to come together. And like as long as you have the space to legitimize yourself with a grouping and create that structure, then we'll help you facilitate that and orient and integrate you into this larger structure to create some alternative. And I kind of just like, I was rereading through it now, and like its first 5 points are that like they welcome all persons of African origin to come and live together, or to come together and dedicate their ideas, skills, and lives to free our people from oppression. And the branches of the organizations of Afro-American Unity may be established by people of African descent wherever they may be and whatever their ideology, as long as they be descendants of Africa and dedicated to our one goal, freedom from oppression. And the rest of the 3 points that all ends with, as long as you're with our one goal, freedom of oppression. It says that the program can be changed, and presented and modified by the membership, taking into consideration national, regional, and local considerations that require flexible treatment and active participation of each member, since we feel each and every Afro-American has something to contribute to our freedom. Thus, each member will be encouraged to participate in the committee of his or her choice, and understanding differences that have been created amongst us by our oppressors in order to keep us divided. The OAAU strives to ignore and submerge these artificial divisions by focusing on our activities and loyalties upon our one goal, freedom from oppression. And I just think about like the ethic that has, and I think about my favorite kind of political friends in Kampa is like we have that ethic, and I think it's that ethic to name around that unity that I don't have on the tip of my tongue, because the first thing that wants to come to my mind is, well, that's my brand of anarchism, but that's not everybody's brand of anarchism right there. And I really think that that's important for like understanding what sort of like decolonial relations we can have and how to like break that down to language. That I love how that whole founder document had like no political malaise. No, like, oh, like, what did they say? Let me look that up real quick. Now we're all here. Let's do this together. If you want to do something, you got to do something. But let's pull up.
Yeah. Um, when I was reading his diaries in prep for this work, especially like where he was talking about his experience in Mecca, and him just kept on commenting about the different colors, the different classes, the different nationalities, and like everyone was the same and everyone was one now in this one place. And I noticed that like these new organizations that he started to like build post his trip to Mecca felt like to me like it was trying to embody that like in a political space where it's like we'll create a container, we'll create a political home where our shared commitment against oppression, to stand up against oppression, is a thing that unites us. And you could come from wherever you are, whatever beliefs that you have, but as long as you're committed to fighting against oppression, then this is a home for you, and this is where we could work from. And I think that reflects Islam, because even if you think about the Prophet's Medina and you think about the Islam that's talked about in the Quran and the ideal space, it's a space based on shared political, like shared committed ethics. It's not about the religion. It's not about your education. It's not about the class, but how you're standing up and supporting each other and committed to a certain set of ethics that is pro-life and against oppression.
It embodies to me, and thank you for noting that here, Isra, like precisely what you noted, the original polity, the Ummah, that the Prophet Muhammad envisioned in Medina and the Medina Charter, right? That this is about transcending race and even religion. Not in a liberal universalist sort of like, anything goes, but what tied to the Medina Charter, what tied members, whether you're Sabian or Jews or Muslims or Christians or Zoroastrians, were the shared spiritual, ethical, political commitments, internally and externally in relationship to one another, how you contended with dimensions within your own traditions, cultures, there are many paths to the same creator, but also in relation with human and non-human life as well, which are life forces within this earth. They're also tribes and nations. And this becomes very critical insofar as, again, his non-ideological underpinnings, that most people tend to vie for siloed positions. I'm a this kind of anarchist, I'm a this kind of Marxist. The gatekeeping the knowledge as opposed to the freeing oneself and the unburdening and the unsettling oneself from these carceral cages of identities, if you will. Again, not in a flaky way, but a way that is anchored in certain ethics and a certain politics and a certain spirit of conduct. How do you offer hospitality to one another? I mean, that's part of it as well, right? It's not about dissing. It's not about namima or bike biting. And you mentioned, and it was mentioned, not wanting to go after the head of the nation of Islam, but rather in a way that fulfills a certain set, Elijah Muhammad, but rather to fulfill a certain ethics and politics, a barometer that we're all held in relationship to. And that becomes a discourse. And that begins as a way of, again, offering hospitality, but also an ethics of disagreement. How do we disagree and engage in conflict resolution in a way that is not destructive? Bearing in mind that, again, he grew up from his nascency, with Louis Langdon and Earl Little, his parents, in the milieu, in upbringing of violence. That's all that we know as people of color, right? So not shying away from violence, but also contending with that violence, but not reproducing it in a way that is destructive when there is conflict. He also knew how to, we're not on the same trajectory. We're not on the same paths. You row your boat down the river. I'll row my boat down the river. We won't mess with one another, but we're after ostensibly different things and different trajectories, at least for now. So, sometimes it's necessary that we need to take time apart in order to engage in that deeper introspection, hopefully, and to be able to come back at a different juncture. Right. So this is why the certain beautiful spirit, he was willing to use violence as a lash, as a whip against those the forces of the above, definitely, but he was more merciful and compassionate and more measured with the below. And I tried to cultivate that spirit, I think, amongst various different groups and factions that existed at the below at the time. So with the spirit of building, as opposed to quote unquote destruction and reaction.
Yeah, I think it's also seen in the way he stood up for Black Americans when like the Muslim world tried to be like, oh well, how could you create the Nation of Islam? That's not Islam. And like, yeah, there's so many books written about this stuff. Like you should just be able to go out there and read and figure it out yourself. And he doesn't internalize it. He doesn't like take it and it's just like, no, actually, that's not, you can't put this on us. You didn't reach out to us. You didn't connect with us. And that's your fault because you knew what the truth was. You knew you had knowledge that we didn't have. And instead of reaching out to us, you just ignored. And I think like he could have so easily, especially once he traveled to Africa and the Middle East and like being accepted by like princes and presidents and like all these like he could have very easily created a new life for himself in these spaces, right? Left the States, created a new place, a protected space, be living in a Muslim country, continuing to elevate his like social and political capital. He could continue to giving his sermons, right, as a guest and like, but he didn't have to continue organizing the people and not coming back to like the States and thinking about Black Americans and what does it mean for like the African American liberation struggle within the context of the States, but also within the global context. And like that is like such a sense of loyalty and still rooting in like the lived experience. So one of the things that Malcolm helped me really clarify was racism. Like when I moved to the States, I was like, when we migrated, I was a racialized body. I grew up like post 9/11. So I was like an Arab Muslim in post 9/11 world. And my experience was, it was the Black kids that had my back and it was the white kids that were causing issues. But also within my home context, there was the anti-Blackness of like, no, you want to associate with certain people, not these people and this and that, or make sure you're in this type of school. And we didn't live in the inner city because we want to make sure that you have access to like a certain type of class of people, like all that shit, right? And it didn't make sense to me because again, like the experience I was having in school is like, it was the Black kids that had my back. It wasn't the fucking white kids. And it was Malcolm that gave me like an actual understanding of what racism is beyond the textbooks at that time, beyond what Martin Luther King was saying. But he was so clear. And I remember when I learned that he was light-skinned and redhead, that was like actually a shock because it was like, because like, why would I be surprised except that if I had a certain image of what it means to be a certain type of Black person, Black man, in the way he was moving and holding himself, right? So like, it forced me to also challenge like the inner colorism and like the racism that I was like holding on to. And like these things, I think kept on showing up in subtle ways. And so like, even like, it's a real, I don't know, maybe it's romanticization of Malcolm. But I don't think we saw like what a fierce force he could have actually been. Because at like that moment of going to the Middle East, to into Africa, making these connections, recognizing the difference between white skin and white mentality, and and being able to connect structural racism and colorism at a different level, I think would have eventually showed up even in his relationships in the Middle East and Africa, right? Like someone recently asked me, it's like, do you think like living up in the States like helped you understand anything like better than other politically? And I was like, honestly, it's racism. There's nothing else in the US that could really sharpen your knife against like what racism actually is, except in the fucking United States. Like you could really, and you don't talk about race the way you talk about race in the States, in Egypt, and other places, like even in other African nations, because it's a different understanding of it and a different experience. And so like, I think eventually Malcolm would have been dangerous to even the above of Africa, of the Middle East, of the regimes that have since fallen or continue to try to hold power, because that contradiction would have quickly shown up, you know?
Yeah, he was inspired to make the Organization for African American Unity after visiting Africa and seeing like the Pan-African Organization, a unity. And whew, what would he be saying about that now?
Right?
I was reading like Amilcar Cabral's statements on it, and he's like admitting the limitations of it, but understanding that it's still a structure that we have to build and reform for something because or at least push to its limits, and is at least like a resource allocator. And if we need something different, let's build something different.
What are some of the limitations then?
Me personally, it's the heads of state. It's an organization, and the only point of delegation is heads of states. And I can just imagine Malcolm seeing the contradictions there and wanting to expose them, and if anything, organize like something around that is able to do that. And that's what I see in like the organization for African American unity, because there's like a point in there where he talks about economic freedom, and he says we have blood banks for when everyone needs blood, we can go and get it. What we need technician banks for all of us with skills and labor to come together so that we can equally and mutually distribute it. We're not relying on this other system. And I just think about like that very basic like facts of like from below and what we have localized, and also creating a network of communication to then be able to have an economic like an economic roots. Like fuck a state, we need trade routes. We need to be able to get resources and skills to places effectively, and not through a capitalist labor distribution system. And I see that, and around that time also, he was also big. He spoke at Martin Sastre's, who's a Black anarchist and jailhouse lawyer at the time when Martin was in the Nation of Islam doing groundbreaking legislation that has paved the roads for like legal incarcerated folks having constitutional rights in the first place, and those being recognized. And Malcolm X at the time, after he left the nation, still came in and spoke, testified on their behalf that they should be able to get their type of Quran, and that they should still have that because they were not allowing any Qurans in. They were not allowing any other books except for the Christian Bible. And I think about like even that amount of unity that he had there, and seeing the strategic purpose of it, and like being like and looking at him as a tactician and a strategic thinker, and analyzing it that way, different ways. I think it grounds in that conversation of always being internationalist and always being from below. Because even that technician bank, he said, needs to be going to Africa and needs to be coming back.
Yep.
And we need to keep having that connection.
Yep. That's really interesting. As we're talking, I'm kind of making the dots between the way the Nation of Islam was able to recruit within the prison system, the same way that the Muqawma and the Islamic movement has been able to do the same in Palestine. And like essentially giving someone who's lost everything something to hold bigger and something to hold on to and to put their faith in and their trust in, how that rejuvenates and like moves us forward. Yeah, and so like there's similarities there, and also there's differences about the above and the below, and like the question I really do keep coming back to with Malcolm is like, would it have been more refined as time goes on about like the differences? Like the Zapatistas in Quintero that I was just at were sharing about their process of like why they changed their governance structure. Because I don't know if y'all know, like 2 years ago, they went from like this organizational structure that was more tiered pyramid where like there's the local level, a mid-level, and like a higher level of councils. And even though the representatives each was rotation based, and so like an attempt to make sure that power doesn't consolidate was just rotating everyone through the different positions, they found that power still consolidated, power still corrupted, things were still happening. And so they disassembled that entire pyramid and essentially built a locals governing structure. And so a lot of time during this encounter was them retelling through theater by the youth the stories, like their lessons from like why they did what they did, the thought process, the pyramid, the capitalist pyramid. And so like in them, I see the similar thing that we see in Malcolm, where like there's this constant evolution of like, okay, we get some data, we try something out, see what's happening, evolve from there, adjust as we need to. And so like I see the traces of Malcolm going deeper into this below analysis of like recognizing that the relationship between race and class, and like especially in places that are not like Euro-Western civilizations, seeing the role of gender and the patriarchy and like in all this, right? But we never fully get that. And it's like the biggest, I think, yeah, a really big loss. Um, and who knows, I might be again romanticizing everything, and we've lost a lot of people along the path.
Yeah, I guess this conversation makes me think about how when I first learned about Malcolm X, one thing that I kind of like in retrospect is that his his self-education and how he came to being more politicized is kind of like a process of decolonization, like looking at whiteness, imperialism has done, how it's influenced certain modes of behavior, how it forces you to name yourself and embody yourself in the image of the oppressor, um, entering and being radicalized even further to the Nation of Islam, and then departing from that in order to gain this more internationalist, Pan-Africanist perspective. And I guess I'm thinking about that in terms of his friendship with James Baldwin and how they related to each other. Because when I think about Baldwin, I think about, yes, Baldwin did lead the U.S., but by his own explanation, it was mainly to clarify the position that he has as a person, as a body, as a Black body, to like the subjugation that Black folks, poor folks experience. And then some of that was also colored by his experience with like Algerian communities and going to Turkey and other places. And so I don't know, I guess in both of them, I see maybe this commitment to like a continuous decolonization in a sense, or waves of it. Like I think about Baldwin, there's a version of him that left the US 24. There's the version of him that returned to do the journalism in the South and to write about it. There's a version of him that was devastated by Malcolm X's assassination, MLK, Edgar Evers, and how, there's just something there that feels very, I don't know, I guess committed to this continuous visitation to decolonization. Because it's interesting, because in my mind, I was also thinking like, oh, it's like I think about the Black Panther Party of the time and how so many high level members of the party did go to other countries, but sometimes it was to visit it, to make connections, but their like internationalism in a lot of ways didn't go that far. And then sometimes they just fled to places because they were fleeing here. And so I don't know, there's something in there that I find really interesting, because maybe to some of what you were saying about growing up and having these experiences in your home with anti-Blackness and then experiencing race in this other way. Like I do think there, for me, it seems very important that like understanding decolonization, unpacking it, looking at the different parts of it in our lives is so central, because there is something there that can force us to confront a lot of these contradictions that we might embody, believe, share consciously or subconsciously. And I don't know, but I really like that part of how Malcolm especially started to grow and shift near the end. And I can kind of admit, when I was researching for this, I was kind of maybe just thinking like, yeah, what's the utility of like this Black sort of nationalism today? Like, could it help us in this moment? How would it kind of help and then become an obstacle? And yeah, and maybe to the point of what was said earlier, like maybe it is just using this mode until we see the things that are wrong with it, and then you reassess, which I think Malcolm also embodied as well. Yeah.
Yeah. I think Malcolm he really took the context into consideration. And that like showed in like some of the sermons, some of the speeches that he's given, like he's talking about the Black experience, the things that like that could be done. But also as he's talking about it, he's clear about like, think about the context that you're in. What's going to work in one space isn't going to work in another. And so he's not willing to really overgeneralize, except for like the big evils, right? Which is oppression, being the biggest of them, and the white devil being like the oppressor in white supremacist world, right? And beyond that, like it felt very like concrete, like look at specific, like where are we here right now? What's going to work for us here? What are we going to do from there? I mean, even the way he like build the different temples for the Nation of Islam, right? Like he didn't spend a lot, like he traveled a lot from one city to the other, going around meeting people, building something, and then moving on to the next one. I'm sure there's some kind of template, right, where he talks like, oh, I would go out to certain areas and I'd meet certain people and I'd talk to certain people. And I'd start to see patterns and this and that, but like each context had to change the same. And it wasn't, he talks in the biography, right? Like he doesn't start to see the results that he wants to see until he starts to basically specialize the response to each context that he's in. And so I think like that, yeah. So context is something that I think about, like it's evident in how he moves and strategizes. And it becomes a way to also connect our international struggles together, right? Like, because if you could like not only think about context, could see the similarities, you can now be connected to the bigger struggle while still be rooted in your actual local struggle and your personal struggles against the system. Yeah.
I think he's able to see the forest and the trees. I think Malcolm, the more that I think about it, is both a method and a methodology. It's a way of being in the world. It's a way of becoming in the world. He leaves to Palestine, 1964. He meets Ahmed al-Shugari. He comes back and he writes, I believe in Al-Ahram newspaper, an article called The Zionist Logic. He's somebody, as you noted, and as you all noted, he has Torah and Jordan and Prince by context. So he's able to distinguish in Islam the difference between al-aqaid, morals, and ethics, usul. What is suitable in one context is not necessarily suitable in another. Thou shalt not kill is a wonderful commandment, but God forbid somebody threaten our lives, then we resort to the right to self-defend ourselves. Right? Even the Quran comes and says, well, pork and alcohol are forbidden, but if there are exceptional circumstances in which there's nothing else and you're to starve or to die, then what else are you to do? If you don't have water to perform ablution, then you perform in Islam what is referred to as tayammum. You take some dirt, rub your hands in it, and then wipe your hands upon your face, and you're in a state of purity. So that ability to distinguish context, ethics from morals. I think the international experience is very interesting because what is generally missing out of Bandung, the Afro-Asiatic, the tricontinental at the time, is a lack of defining in tangible and material terms what sort of governance then are we going for if we're talking about a pan something. Everybody's critical of capitalism and imperialism, but then what is the governance model? And that's never defined, because that means as people of color, we need to define or re-understand new conceptualizations of sovereignty that transcend nation states, products like Pico, colonialism, imperialism, etc. But there's an understanding within Malcolm, and I think that's part of his responsibility in terms of American exceptionalism. Right? He's anti-America. He condemns the American dream. He says it's always been, an American nightmare. We then land on Plymouth Rock. Plymouth Rock landed on us. His ability, as we've been discussing, of self-critique, the dimension of prisoners that was raised, right? Himself being incarcerated, what that means in terms of the muqawma. I mean, prisoners are on the fringes of the fringes. They are the backbone to any revolutionary movement, really. So that kind of grasp and understanding of what prisoners are, when I come to think about General Sinwar being a prisoner himself, organizing the release of over 1,000 Palestinian prisoners, him stopping the release that included his own because of 4 prisoners of Al-Quds, of Jerusalem, that needed to be freed as well. And who is he freed by? And it's vis-a-vis a deal with Jalad Shalit, a Zionist soldier that was captured by Commander Mohamed Abdou. So all these different facets, I think, he He's a method and a methodology. And I think there's something that's very elucidating of that, of constantly focusing on the fringes of the fringes, because there are many dimensions also of the below, and not all who are alike, right? So in a way, he was a living embodiment of a decolonization in action, of an unflinching solidarity. I shudder to think, in the discourse of the moment that we're living right now, that, first of all, with the abstract labels of, okay, I support the resistance without naming what the resistance is, as if there's this fear of the word Hamas or Qassam or Ansarullah and so on and so forth, while recognizing the difference between the different axes of resistance. But also at the same time, this fear of supporting even the resistance because they're not queer enough, they're not feminist enough, they're not this or that, as opposed to meeting people where they were at, especially when they're living an ongoing genocide. And again, they're living decolonization in action. It's why you just pointed out to the restructuring that is going on in terms of the governance model with regards to the Zapatistas, that ability to constantly engage in, again, al-jihad al-akbar and the self-critique as one is moving forward consistently and continuously. So yeah, the moment that you live and experience, the moment that you visit Palestine, Malcolm comes back and writes this article on Zionism, right? Yeah, it's this constant malleability, dynamism, self-reflexivity, introspection. Yeah, it's a walking, talking Quran embodied, not simply memorizing the Quran, not simply, spewing out a few verses, because he wasn't a merchant of Islam the way that scholars are nowadays. God said this and God said that, and, there you go. But again, he was a living, embodied praxis of it. Fallible, absolutely. But that's part of what makes a prophet a prophet. I mean, even Prophet Muhammad was fallible, right? And not in the same way that casually perhaps other people are fallible, but nonetheless, there is that element, right? And there's a beauty in that in terms of the fragility, the vulnerability. And I guess that's what I meant by Malcolm's transparency. He didn't shy away from vulnerability. Somebody like Elijah Muhammad didn't want to be vulnerable. He didn't want his chair to be shook. He was a prophet, and a prophet is infallible. Malcolm wasn't that kind of a prophet, right? And I think that's what makes him so beautiful to us, who came after. Again, the element of humility and the desire to constantly transcend and not to pretend to be something that one is not, right? I don't want the chair. I don't covet authority. I want to change. I want to evolve. There are good things inside me, and there are things that I'm constantly going to be building on based on my experiences with everything, every idea, everybody else along the way. So yeah, it brings, to what extent and what would Malcolm say insofar as settler colonialism, insofar as 1492, insofar as black bourgeoisie, a lot of different things that now we're contending with having a different set of ornaments and language that was also given to us by other ancestors, right? How will the analysis evolve? How would his understanding of a Quran of the resistance, a Quran of the oppressed, a liberatory Islam, a revolutionary Islam, where would that be going to, right? In relationship to Judaism, in relationship to Christianity, in relationship to multiplicity, in relationship to indigenous sovereignty, black self-determination, especially now at the expense of 60 years that have passed, right? And this was in the height of anti-colonial and decolonial quote-unquote movements, with, again, all the flaws that they entailed of using the master's tools, to dismantle the master's house, let's try and use the nation state to do this and that, the unity between Egypt and Syria, Pan-Africanism, and so on. But I'm sure it's also maddening to think that, what, he would have turned 100? Yeah, whoa, another 60 years? Because I find him like the General Sinwar. He was a race against time. Constantly, right? He wasn't coveting again. He wasn't lured by the seductions of earthly material anything. He was a person on a mission, And he was not ambivalent at all to his finality. Again, he was living with death constantly. Um, um, and after a particular objective. So to think, 60 years, they accumulated rage, they accumulated love, they accumulated mourning for all of us, including for Africa. Because again, when one comes to think about the context of the Black Spring, right? 2020, it's just like, as I'm sure we talked many times before, there are no Trayvon Martins, Michael Browns, George Floyd's, Breonna Taylor's, right? But then what is that in the context of AFRICOM? And what is going on in terms of the genocides of the Sudan and the Congo and so on and so forth. So it only leaves one in a state of rage and a state of elegy. But it's just like, have we not gotten there yet? And we're nowhere close to the 60s and 70s. We're way far off. And all the revolutionary potential and figures and inspirations. On the contrary, we're tearing each other apart as quote unquote, as leftists, as people on the same side. And now you have the rise of the alt-right and the messed upness of the discourse, because, they were people of clear-cut black and white, if you will. Things were clear. The gray, the ambiguous, there weren't a people of the mediocrity, I think, our ancestors, right? But now what we see is a conflation of discourses between, we have right-wingers like, Tucker Carlson and I don't know who else, right? That are just vying for a Palestinian cause. And we find Palestinian and Muslim and Arab influencers, and with, Andrew Tate, and there's this conflation of a hyper toxic masculinity and misogyny and confluence, and then that is a bedfellow to white supremacy just because, well, they're speaking in defense of Palestine. Mayory Taylor Greene opposing the Zionist genocide, and but she'll stop there. She won't talk about the right to self-defense, right? It's just like, oh, well, what would happen if you're American and your children were being killed and we stop this genocide? This is a white supremacist, right? But and yet we see Arabs and Palestinians just like, yeah, what they're talking to her on Twitter and emboldening her and saying, yeah, Zionist values are not Western values.
Yeah, I've
That
seen
kind of
the Palestinian and Confederate flag sticker.
Oh, that is.
Sad.
yeah.
I don't even know what to say to that. Wow.
So it's a very discombobulating, my point is, a very discombobulating discursive moment in which the gray muddies what should be right and wrong, light and dark, right? And what would have been really interesting, because we brought this up, given the discourse that the veil, the face of America, really, certainly with Obama and, with Genocide Joe and with Trump, masks off completely, right? Not only would Malcolm's trajectory would be now, but what would he say about the acute realization that the Crusader mask is completely off? That this is a proclaimed apocalyptic religious war. Like something that General Sinwar had noticed, something that even Nasrallah didn't completely see. He was under the impression and operating with the Zionist entity as if he's dealing with the Zionist entity from 2006. The general knew, and he said it very clearly prior to the Blessed Tufan al-Aqsa, that if you want this as a religious war, it will be as such. We will burn the green and the brown. There is no safe haven. Of course, it's been a religious war since 1492. The Crusades never ended. But what I mean to say is, what would Malcolm, how would that embolden ostensibly the closeted part of Islam, right? The domesticated part of Islam. Not that he ever shied away again from Islam, but as we're speaking, he was cautious in that being the central vehicle, if you will, or anything being the central vehicle, because he was juggling in a very interdisciplinary way, if you will, all kinds of causes simultaneously at the same time: queer, black, feminist, anti-imperialist, racial capitalist discourses simultaneously. But he was like water that way, right? How would this moment that should lead one would think to more clarity have led to even a more clarified, clear-eyed discourse for him, and for all of us, ostensibly speaking?
I think going back to like that that understanding of like the ethics of a tool and like what is a master's tool and breaking down that and like how things have been used. And in conversations I've been having with the homie with and in the belly, Polo Pierre Pinson, locked up in SDR in Pennsylvania, talking about like the Bible of the slaves that they had and like how they were like legitimately different. And like the different mixing of different ethics with different things and holding on to like inherent, like not inherent, but like more like indigenous rooted practices, while also like building with like what is around you and like what's like a common communicator or a common understanding or framework. And I think about like how and why we study Malcolm X and still find them so influential and like what even is the ethics of that. And I think he gives us that answer in studying him and always having that context and having more knowledge to have more of like an informed consent, having more like, and you can see that with like the relations with governance and family and in structure. And like being um someone like, oh, you bring someone like who hasn't brought someone into an organization, you were like, maybe I shouldn't have done that. Or her, things like that. And that's something that he's trying to live through and down, understanding the different relations and dispositions that tools have. Like a tool like may have like its own disposition, its relation to other actors, other things that can act upon it, but we bring our own ethics and sense of duty to that same tool, and being able to understand that as a power, as something that then we can name and work around, and all that's done through having a space to share and communicate, and like having that communication as power, and making this decision, more context, and giving that and having more knowledge, thirst for it, I feel like is that container of it that makes him like not an ideologue, but if anything, just like someone who just like brings people together. And I think like the ethics of Malcolm X and thinking about like how we study people and how people get glamorized and what other people who are what like Malcolm X is being sold to people, what even in radical spaces, like what Harriet Tubman is being sold to people, what John Brown is being sold to people. Like when I think of Harriet Tubman, I think of all the like also like yeah, they went up and down a lot. They were a great hiker and that shit was fucking beautiful, but also it never stopped. They built economic mutual like material structures for wash stations, for sanitary needs, and for all these different things. John Brown had their own economic, they were working with the family. That's a real family business. Killing slave owners across town, across state, across Turtle Island. That's a family business. And like had different economic and strategic across borders. Like the borders that were there were just something to be worked around. And I think about that with Malcolm X and having this like inherently internationalist framework. And thinking about like yeah, there's different possibilities, but also like what has been sharpened by just this study of Malcolm X that we have. And also what is like I'm thinking about like what are the parts of him that are being dulled.
Yeah.
Whether through like the film or theatrical releases, which I feel like maybe you're more equipped to.
Yeah, I do. I have a response to that, but I guess I keep coming back to what was being said earlier about like I don't know, basically like the co-optation of certain modes of it's just like Marjorie Taylor Greene's being like,
Yeah.
I don't know, being against and I guess maybe if I'm extracting what Malcolm can allow us to be critical about or clear about is I took the note like when I hear like freedom from oppression, I kind of was taking some notes earlier and I wrote that that phrase requires us to know who the oppressor is, who is being oppressed, to imagine a way to free like yourself and those around you. And like what does white supremacy and imperialism and these other modes of subjugation like demand? They demand the freedom to oppress the other. And so when we look at like how some forms of language or ideas are being co-opted by like the alt-right, it reminds me of how Malcolm, I guess through his like departure from the Nation of Islam, like if I can synthesize it, it's like the enemy of my enemy is not always my friend if we don't have the same end goal. And how if we can apply that analysis to today with the demand for freedom from oppression, I think there's a lot of clarity that can be brought forward. I think there's a lot of space to be critical of people that want justice, but they want justice only to the point where they can have a certain kind of normal or they can have a position of power, and how important it always is in any political situation to be critical of that. And I don't know, like and especially when I think about how last year in the presidential election felt and people telling people to vote for the weaker enemy or whatever. Like I guess when I think of my own anger, it was like I don't believe the enemy of my enemy is always my friend. And to believe that is to be manipulated, which I think is why Malcolm X was so critical of like the peaceful nonviolent kind of strategy and wanting legislation and how eventually you still have to demand for your human rights. And so it does create a kind of compelling way to look at what's happening now because so many things are being co-opted.
Yeah, and I think one of the big things that's being co-opted too is like that whole like knowing your enemy line. Like Margaret Killjoy just had to write an essay recently about how they got quoted by a right winger because the right winger agreed with Gavin Newsom about fucking up homeless people. And they were like, sometimes you got to know your enemy. And then they were like explicitly like, that's a quote from Margaret Killjoy. And it's like, wait, what?
That's
so,
crazy.
like, and now in like
crazy.
liberalism and US settler colonialism in this like anti-Trump and anti-fascist rhetoric and like seeing like coalition politics and like good confederalist or like even just federalized structures built around and still with US settler colonialism in this anti-fascism moment is a huge contradiction. And I think it is that moment of like, do we actually know our enemy and can we name them? And like being able to talk about what is dangerous or what is that sort of point of view.
About what do you say? You can't stick a knife into a man's back 9 inches, pull it out 6 inches, and call it progress. It's just like,
Right. Yeah, I think like Malcolm was sharp with his words, did very clear analysis. He didn't try to make friends. He called it for what it is. And with that, there's actually freedom in the fact that you could stop trying to make it work, right? Like it's like you're dating someone, you're trying to find the things that like salvage. Like remember when you first started dating, why did I like this person, blah, 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 but shitty things keep popping up and you're like, no, 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 no. And you're trying to find reasons. He's just like, no, there is no reason. And now we're going to look for other options, right? And we're going to build our other options, which it's very similar. What I'm noticing is like with the rhetoric around Palestine, where you have those who are, we're still trying to be reformist with international law and find the redeeming factor of international law and why is it international law stepping in. And then there's those who they're not trying to make it make sense, right? They're like, okay, it is what it is. And now we have to build something alternative, right? And there is a lot of freedom in that. And there's also a lot of fear because it does require you to like step out on a ledge of the unknown and really put your like life on the line. And when you see Malcolm and Martin being pitted against each other, that's where the difference for me starts to like show up is like on one end, we're still trying to make it make sense and like repair it and like forget about what the structure actually is. On the other end, it's no, this is what it is. And we've rejected this whole thing and we're going to try to build something else. And so like in his sermons and his talks, yeah, he is talking about the black dollar and keeping our own shops and like building our own systems and our own schools and doing all this stuff. And I'd be very curious to see like how some of these ideas would have evolved if he was still around. And I think it is a critique of like how he was able to disseminate his message is that like once he was gone, there was such a vacuum. He went from we can't speak about him at all to now, yeah, films being made about him. Now in high school, you're learning about Malcolm X. Yes, it still might be a sentence, and he's usually put in contrast to Martin Luther King. But the question is still the same, which is the same question we see in Palestine, which is, do we reform it or do we say, no, it doesn't work and we start from scratch, right? And those are very different approaches, strategies, tactics, and like just way of being.
It's also how liberalism affects all kinds of trajectories, including the left, individualism, Islamophobia, and a lot. I mean, we're constantly talking about who the enemy is. Well, what about the enemy inside us? What the left is incapable, what anarchists are not Islamophobic, leftists aren't queerphobic, sexist, misogynist. All these. This is where the spirituality, I think, plays a certain role. That is inseparable from an analysis or a view of Malcolm. And any form of spirituality, as a matter of fact, and not necessarily exclusively Islam. Because what spirituality is meant to instill, one loses faith in order to refine it. That's part of chapters, as in the Quran at least, as chapters of the iron, right? Iron is shield, but iron is also sword. And the ability to constantly confront, because it's not an oppression that exists external to us, but rather that is internal to us. It's sort of like having an anti-imperialist analysis without looking at the engine and fuel that is U.S. settler colonialism or crusading settler colonialism, of which there's so much of. It's just like pointing at Zionism as the evil entity, but okay, Nazis and Zionists look to who exactly? For blood quantum, for settler colonialism. Not that it has to be mapped 100%. But there is a greater parent here, and that is settler colonial. The inability to want to have the cake and eat it too. We want to free Palestine, but we don't want to contend with a monster in the mirror. Because we preserve idealistically the hyphenated American, the Native American, the Black American, the Asian American, the queer, the this, the that American, the Muslim American, without contending with the fact that, well, the only American that doesn't have to hyphenate their name is the white American because they're assumed to be the native of the land. So that cataclysmic desire or need to contribute more than one can spare, and particularly on behalf of, in my humble opinion, settler immigrants, in the context of Turtle Island, there is just that holding on to the ash, the non-existent ember of the so-called American dream that's constantly attempted to be recuperated or recovered. Is just like, well, it's about incremental change. That's the liberal moment. That's the moment. It's just like, oh, well, let's take over the state. It's just like, sorry, what world are you going to deal with dismantling exactly the medical, the pharmaceutical, the agrochemical, the prison to school nexus, industrial complexes, and so on and so forth. It's an impossible investment, right? Why don't you operate laterally? Why don't you build communities? But again, the hyper-individualism, the hyper-authoritarianism that we all internalize because of daddy, the nation state, and capitalism as mommy, inculcates us with that desire to covet power. And we see it in the Instagram culture, the influencer culture, and the everything. The self-promotion, right? I know the way. And I will preach to you as a Palestinian, as a whatever, what is necessary and how to speak about Palestine. Where the sense of responsibility, given the geography and the context that we were precisely speaking to and that Malcolm embodied, insofar as, again, the fact that we're settler colonialists on stolen land. Or have we, and do we not need to center that, right? So this is the constant liberal moment. Let me go fight with their khofa, with whatever other cause that exists outside, without having to contend with, again, the monster that exists right here, right now. Right? Are you willing to pick up arms? Okay, you love Hamas, you love Al-Qassam, you're willing to go, oh, if I only have an opportunity to go do this, that, there. Right? Why don't you do it right where you're at? And of course, we do have examples, right? That come once in a while. Right? Vis-a-vis self-immolation or assassinations of Zionists in the heart of empire. But where is the prolongation of that? Because at the same time, we're talking about an empire that not only needs to be substituted, but needs to be burnt to the ground. Right? So yeah, goddamn Israel, but goddamn America too. And I think that the failure of, again, it comes from the logic of we're only going to give what we can spare. We're not going to share the same fate as Black people, as indigenous people, as people in Palestine, as people in Gaza, and so on. And I think that's the thing. Either we share the same fate or we don't. The global south is not a geography, it's a condition. One finds it on a reservation, one finds it in gentrified neighborhoods. In Harlem, you find it everywhere. But I think part of the crisis and the problem too that exists now is the necessity to pick up where Malcolm, where Martin, where Nkrumah, where the Panthers, and we have elders of Ashanti that have evolved also, right? But it's the left is constantly embroiled in wanting to use the same instruments, the same language, the same mode of analysis that existed in the 60s and 50s and 70s, right? That again led to wonderful things, but they were also flawed. And if our ancestors were alive now and were killed and were murdered and were assassinated, they'd be somewhere else.
Some who are elder, they're like, it's your context. Like every time we talk to an old Black Panther, ex-Panther, they're like, what do we do now? And they're like, y'all ain't talking about it? Like, what are y'all talking about? Like, it's your generation. And my pushback is, it's our generation. What are we doing about it? But it's like, yeah, that's
Exactly. And we sit on the shoulders of our elders, and our elders, some of whom are still alive, like Renzo, like Ashanti, they've evolved too. I mean, they're part of that era, and their trajectory and their politics and their nuance. And again, when one looks at particularly to somebody like Ashanti, who I've known for close to going on 25 years, his evolution, his desire, Ashanti loves to read about queer theory and gender theory and feminist theory, all dimensions that the Panthers weren't necessarily as attuned to, the elements of hierarchies, and so on and so forth. And that led to an evolution of his politics, God bless him. But the sense of responsibility that we also as a new generation have to bear to our elders that are still alive with us now, and to carry that message forward. And Ashanti, alhamdulillah, is still going and interacting and engaging with the youth and building with them and learning from them. It's that beauty that again comes from that place of revolutionary rage and love simultaneously, but the growth, the concept of the pushing of the bounds and the limits. And that's where I think the spirit of Malcolm courses. And what people that try and claim him as a Marxist or as a this or as a that or whatever it may be, a bit trap it's a Malcolm of utility to serve some ideological sort of polemic and rhetoric to galvanize mobilizations, and not a form of organization, or not to appreciate the largeness of Malcolm as a method and as a methodology, as an ethic.
You read his old letters that were hidden. It's crazy. It's like we all have growth, and I think about like how we drag the dead and what we do to them through our memory and how we do that. And that's some of the complications of like how do we talk about Malcolm X or talk about people and like embody that.
Yeah. And classical anarchists do it all the time. Emma, Bakunin, Kropotkin, Proudhon, and so on and so forth. It's just like, okay, great. These were your white prophets, but prophets need to grow too. They need to evolve as well, from spiritual perspectives, from all kinds of different perspectives, right? We have a different understanding of power now. George Jackson, a lot of the works. We know that power is fluid. We know that we all have power right here, right now. Right? So what is why our elders said all power to the people. They then just say power to the people. Okay, what can we do with that power right here, right now, in this moment, today, yesterday, before today, tomorrow, before the day after, right? And to take the means and the tools into our own hands, right? For our people, again, that have been struggling with an ongoing genocide for over 533 years. This is new. And if that doesn't fill one with sort of not a sense of urgency and emergency, let alone, again, a climate crisis, so many things that our fates are intertwined with. We all breathe the same air. We all need food, ultimately. And so really a radical break from the order. And there is no other way to do that but in a violent way, because decolonization is inherently violent, as Fanon teaches us, as Malcolm never shied away from, and so on and so forth. So it's the recorruption of certain legacies, that Gandhi, MLK's trajectory, the March on Washington, the anti-imperialism of Vietnam, right? He was also moving in sort of somewhat Malcolm's trajectory, right? But the desire to pigeonhole, right? And not critique. I mean, what about the anti-blackness, the misogyny of Gandhi? Isn't it Gandhi that said, if there's violence in our hearts, then it's better to be violent than to don the cloak of nonviolence, the cover for our impotence? But again, we take what we want to take that suits the ends and the means that we want to achieve, or to reaffirm what already pre-exists in our minds. But the beauty about Malcolm is that he wasn't afraid to question pre-existing assumptions that existed in his mind. And that takes so much courage, so much courage. Anarchists are Marxists too. Can we evolve? Can we grow? Can we build? Or are we beholden to some sacred tradition because it says so? But that's playing God. That's playing purity politics. That is the most crude, to be shunned arrogance. We all have things to learn from one another, and growth to build. Otherwise, there's no point of a symbiotic relationship between each other, let alone with non-human life.
Yeah, I think we're gonna wrap it up with one last question, and we have like, what are we taking away from this conversation and from the study of Malcolm with us today?
I mean, for me, I think it's really like, what does it mean to constantly be evolving, to not get too tied up into any one identity or ideology or way of thinking, be confident enough in myself that I don't have to define myself based on what these ideologies say should be, shouldn't be, and like, what does it look like to actually be engaged in deep self-critical reflection in a way that is against the dominant forces of power.
For me, reaffirmation ideologies don't exist. And no one idea can answer and resolve all the problems in the world. As is each holding each other's hands, we ask one another what each of us knows. This is how we make sure that we leave no one behind and we move forward. I'm honored to have been a part of this and to learn from you all, your Malcolm, as well as mine, in ways that are shared and in ways that are distinct and singular. But yeah, I'm deeply honored to have been a part of this. Thank you.
Yeah, I'm reflecting a lot on kind of, I don't know how succinct this is put together a lot of my Black August study so far with other comrades, and yeah, honored to share it with you all. And I think that's the point. And I think about how inspiring it is to live and see in the tradition and know that there's more to come outside, and like, this is what is shared with the world, and y'all can't even imagine the offline conversations.
I think I'm leaving with a reminder to continue to have a relationship with my rage, to understand it as a potential weapon when combined with study and understanding and revisitation, and to understand that it is overwhelming to live in a world fucked up by imperialism and all these violences. But with Malcolm, what feels comforting is that he seemed endlessly committed to the ability to express and revisit ideas and to understand that to be so powerful, like the power of oration and study. And I guess sometimes I forget that I'm working in that tradition, or it feels overwhelming, but I think this conversation has kind of helped me ground myself again and to understand I'm on the right path one way or another.
Hey listeners, The Dugout is all about sharing Black radical history and ideas to spark learning and action. If you've gained anything from these conversations, especially if you think we're cute, consider supporting us on Patreon. Your support helps us cover production costs, bringing on our amazing guests, getting Jordan all cozy before they smoke their little doobie before each episode, and beyond. Plus, you'll get early access to interviews and exclusive reading episodes. Head to patreon.com/the Dugout Pod to join us and keep this work going.
Right now in Sudan, anarchist comrades are organizing in the middle of a war, repression, and displacement. The anarchist group in Sudan is building mutual aid, grassroots committees, and political education for survival and liberation. They need our support. You can stand with them by making a one-time donation, holding your own fundraiser and sending the funds to the Open Collective, Support Sudanese Comrades, link in bio, or become a monthly supporter at that same Open Collective link. Every contribution strengthens their ability to keep resisting and caring for their people. Solidarity means action. Tap the link in our bio or in the show notes and support the anarchist group in Sudan today.